You've gotta know that nothing lasts forever.
Hey guys, it's Steven here from the Upshift Car Blog, and today I'm going to be talking about my 2004 M3 and my 2005 330 Ci with the ZHP Performance Package. So, there's been a lot of talk, a lot of articles written about whether the ZHP is special. Is it kind of going to be a classic? Is it, what makes it so good? And most importantly is pricing. So ZHP cars have steadily been increasing in price, kind of closely following the M3 a little bit in terms of like the appreciation curve. And nowadays, especially on Bring a Trailer, where you see like the really nice examples, ZHP cars between 70 and 130 or so thousand miles are selling between $10,000 and $15,000. So in the $10,000 and $15,000 range, you can also get an M3. And that kind of begs the question here: should you buy a ZHP? Are ZHPs overpriced? Is it better to buy an M3 for that price instead? And, I want to tell you from an owner's perspective what I think on the whole situation. So first, what makes the ZHP special? Well, first, there's only about 13,500 of these made for between 2003 and 2005, which was the only years that you could option the ZHP package on convertibles, coupes, and sedans. And, of 13,500 made, keep in mind that each year for E46, so the 325i, 330i, 330ci, 325ci, the convertible models, and everything in between, they sold about roughly 100,000 each year here in the States. So just keep that in mind with how kind of rare these ZHP package cars are, or at least how rare a real ZHP package car is. So what are some differences? Well, first off, and the most obvious, are these really gorgeous looking Style 135 wheels. They're staggered setup on normal ZHPs, mine is a square setup. Also, the biggest obvious difference too is the M-Tech 2 body kit. So you get that M-Tech 2 front bumper, M-Tech 2 side skirts, and the M-Tech 2 rear bumper. Also, some things that were on ZHP cars: unique ZHP exhausts, unique ZHP suspension with firmer suspension, and revised damping to help provide like a sportier performance, shorter rear differential ratio for improved acceleration, unique front and rear sway bars, so they're about half an inch bigger for better body control. ZHP cars also got this shadow line trim here. So this is a gloss black trim. It's not kind of the flat black that you normally see. So this trim is pretty highly sought after, and it looks really, really good and helps to kind of improve the appearance of any E46. So in addition to the suspension modifications, there's also beefed up lower front control arms, so ZHP specific control arms, which help to improve handling. And underneath the hood, which you won't be able to see, but I'll show you anyways, is revised camshafts. So ZHP specific camshafts that improved horsepower by 10. So you got 235 horsepower instead of 225. There are also some interior differences. So first off, you could get the Alcantara interior. So you can kind of see these really wonderful Alcantara seats. You could also option leather if you wanted to. A 6-speed manual instead of the 5-speed. You could also get a Tiptronic automatic. Definitely the manual, that was the way to go here. Cube trim, which I replaced with this aluminum look, but you'll definitely instantly recognize that cube trim. Get the M steering wheel. And the biggest difference is going to be this gauge cluster here. So you get the orange needles, the kind of silver bezels on those gauges there, and the 6,800 RPM red line. So every kind of normal E46 has a 6,500 RPM redline. 6,800 was for ZHPs only to help kind of take advantage of those camshafts. So, you know, a very unique car with a lot of small but unique features. It was a product of BMW individual, so I guess technically you could say you have an individual car. And, you know, common misconception I hear a lot is that, oh, it's, you know, it's an M3 without the M3 suspension, and that is definitely not true. It's more like a really nicely upgraded 330. Let's move on to my E46 M3 here. So first off, you could see the power bulge in the hood. Looks so aggressive. And the bulging fenders, again, just look phenomenal. My car has the optional 19-inch wheel package, the diamond cut wheels, which, when they look sharp, they really do look sharp. Let's go ahead and move on here. So you can kind of see a difference between the facelift and non-facelift coupe headlights. Facelift coupes are one pieces, and non-facelift, or pre-facelift I should say, are two pieces. Not sure which one looks better. They both kind of have their pros and cons. Underneath the hood of this M3 is the wonderful S54 engine, individual throttle bodies, 3.2 liters, fourth highest piston velocity of any engine of its time. So it's only beat out by the Lamborghini Gallardo and two other Honda. The thing was like an Integra Type R and another Type R Honda perhaps. So pretty awesome for a 6-cylinder. And I don't think I mentioned the colors yet. So my ZHP is sparkling graphite over Alcantara interior, and my M3 is mystic blue over gray leather interior. My car is gray leather with the SMG, and all M3s have this unique gauge cluster which tells you with adaptive red line, and of course that gray face on the gauges. So let's go ahead and drive them and see how they drive. Alright, so driving this car, first thing is you instantly sit in this car and just feel comfortable. One of my favorite things about this car is you just sit in it and everything just kind of comes to hand. So the steering wheel, the shifter here, and it's just so easy to get comfortable in this car. Second thing is the car is just really easy to drive. Like this clutch is really easy to use. The shifter is really, feels nice. It's not the greatest shifter. Don't expect like Honda type shifting, but it's a pretty decent manual. I'd say I'd give it maybe like a 7 out of 10. Overall, this interior has also held up pretty well here. The materials held up pretty well. There is a little bit of a rattle from my passenger door here. And let's go ahead and do some acceleration. Let's see how it does. So definitely not the fastest car, but man, the engine just pulls so smoothly. It's like butter. Also kind of interesting is I feel like the shifter is easy to shift at higher RPMs. I can't quite prove that, but to me it just feels a little better the faster you drive this car. Look at this little interesting Scion TC over here. One of my favorite things about the ZHP is that it's just so livable. In terms of like interior noise, I measured it about 84 decibels, so it's actually quieter than my M3. In terms of fuel economy, so it's about 17.25 highway. So 17 city, 25 highway, which I tend to nail pretty often here, so fuel economy isn't bad. But, when you think about today's cars, my friend's Camaro with double the horsepower gets basically the same gas mileage, so I guess that's what they call progress. But even still, this is such a wonderful engine, even though it doesn't make the most amount of horsepower anymore, and even if the fuel economy isn't the best. It's just such a smooth engine, such easy to drive engine as well. Power, everywhere in the RPM range. one of my favorite parts about the ZHP is the steering. So, you know, there is kind of this whole rabbit hole you can go down on the internet about what makes the ZHP steering special. You kind of catch this green light here. But to me, this has to be one of the best steering of any car that I've ever driven. In terms of the speed, it's I think 13.7 to 1 is the steering ratio, and it just feels so good. There's tons of feel, tons of feedback, and you know, I've driven a lot of cars from, you know, ISF to, you know, obviously my M3, NSX, you know, M340i, 135i, you know, Miatas, and I'd say this car still has the best steering of any car that I've driven. So it just feels so good. And I guess that's kind of the appeal of this car, is that, you know, even though it's not the fastest, there's just so much, you know, to love about driving this car. And I think that's one thing that's really, you know, keeps people coming back to this car, is just the nostalgia of just pure driving experience and just how organic it is. And, you know, talking about the interior a little bit more, my car has a Harman Kardon audio, which, you know, doesn't sound too bad, but it's definitely not the greatest stereo system. But again, you know, you're not really driving these cars for, you know, abundant stereo. Man, I just love how smooth this car is. It's just so livable every day. Now, even though, you know, driving manual can get a little bit tedious, this manual is very easy to use, and you could absolutely daily drive this manual. The clutch isn't heavy at all. Gear shifts are nice and easy. The suspension is pretty comfortable. One thing that I will say is that my car isn't completely stock, so I do have SD coilovers, M3 front sway bar, and convertible rear sway bar. But I've modified it so that the ZHP unit stays the same. So with the sway bar, the M3 front, and the convertible rear, it actually maintains the same handling balance as factory, just with a little bit stiffer sway bars. But, you know, comparing my you know, stock ZHP that I drove to a stock M3 that I drove, and the ZHP still rides better, still is just so much more comfortable. Interior is quiet as well. Ooh, there's a C8, nice. And one of my favorite things about this ZHP is that not only is it daily drivable, but it's really fun in the canyons. You know, I'd say that my ZHP and my M3 are pretty similar in terms of just pure driving fun in the canyons. One thing that I do kind of wish this car had, though, was a limited slip. That's definitely the biggest deficit that I'd say to the ZHP, was that there's no, you know, factory limited slip differential offered. It's only exclusive to the M cars. But still, like with a square tire setup, you can get this car to handle really well and rotate beautifully in corners. But, you know, despite some of the modifications that I've made, you know, I've done, you know, streets of Willow, big wheel in terms of track days, and the M3 is still a better track car, but even still, this will still hold its own on the track. I'd say that overall, this car is probably best between like 0 and 7/10 kind of driving, whereas the M3, as you'll see, is a little bit more tuned towards like kind of the higher end. Hopefully we can get a clear off ramp here. Let's see if we get. Man, the handling balance on this car is just so beautiful. This has to be one of my favorite handling cars, even without a limited slip. It's just so planted, so stable too in the corners. One of my favorite things about, you know, a good handling car is that it really works all four tires. It doesn't just put a ton of pressure on the front too. And this car really kind of, you could feel that all four tires are really working when you're in the corner, and just the handling balance is just so neutral, yet it's so comfortable day to day. And I think that's one thing that makes the ZHP so special, is that, you know, you can really hustle it hard and still be comfortable in your day-to-day commutes. Nice little Porsche Targa here, Targa S, 996 maybe, I believe, or 991. Porsche generations really confuse me, but still a nice Porsche around here. So in terms of maintenance on this car, common problems include the VANOS, which is the variable valve timing system. You can buy like a retrofit kit, or you can buy like the whole unit. Cooling system too is a huge issue with this car, so make sure you get that done early before it blows up on you. So what I mean by blow up is usually the expansion tank, which is plastic, will crack and cause your car to overheat. So make sure you get those parts done. Thermostat, water pump, expansion tank, radiator, hoses. Those are pretty much the big things that you're going to want to do. Besides that, this car has been really reliable. You know, the only things besides cooling systems I've done is consumables like brakes, tires, front control arm bushings, so they're like the lollipops, and the rear differential bushings. But these cars, as long as you put some preventive maintenance into it, like the cooling system stuff, they'll easily run 200,000 miles, no problem. And you know, there are a lot of people who are running, you know, over 200,000 miles on these cars, 250,000 miles. So to say that these cars, you know, aren't reliable is kind of false. It's just people who don't do preventive maintenance on these that, you know, wonder why their car is broken all of a sudden. You know, you have to maintain it a little bit more meticulously than, say, a Toyota. But as long as you do like the preventive maintenance on these cars, they're really wonderful and reliable. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and hop into my M3 next. And let's go see how it compares to the ZHP here. Alright, so here in the M3, first off, you can just feel how much more raw this car is. So when you first start the car, the engine kind of comes alive, this mechanical sound. And then also the RPM, the idle RPM is a little bit higher, so it's about 1,000 RPM, whereas my ZHP, my 330, is right around about 600 RPM. So also, you know, the higher red line, just instantly you could tell that this car is so much more performance oriented, and it's kind of has a little bit more of a rawness to it. Let's go ahead and plop her in manual. Again, this car has the SMG. What is this guy doing? Alright, so let's go ahead and give her some gas and let's see how she does. So pretty fun. I mean, this car definitely could feel the extra, you know, 100 horsepower, and also that 8,000 RPM red line. Just this car just feels so much more raw and so much more savage. And my car also has the SMG. So the SMG is pretty much a manual. It's an automated manual gearbox. You know, around town it's a little bit derpy, but really when you're hammering it, this transmission really comes alive. I bought this car with the intention of manual swapping it, and after kind of driving it around a little bit, you know, I'm kind of changing my opinion on that. I got the CSL tune, which helps to improve shift speed, and also you get rev match downshifts, whether you're on the gas or off the gas, whereas, you know, regular SMGs, if you're not on the gas, you're going to get launched through the window if you're, you know, downshifting. Shift speed and its fastest setting is 0.08 seconds. So this is actually faster than, you know, an F430, faster than, you know, an ISF, which is 0.1. It's only 0.02 of a second slower than the dual clutch M3, the V8, you know, dual clutch E92, E90 M3s, which were 0.06 of a second. So this, you know, as much as people hate on this SMG, it's actually pretty, you know, pretty good for the time. You have to remember this came out around 2000, and there really weren't any good automatics at the time. You know, think about, you know, they're just all slush boxes, and the only kind of cars that had this kind of F1 style gearbox were, you know, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and, you know, they weren't any smoother than this either. You know, I always talk about how good the steering is in my ZHP. You probably heard me, or will hear me, depending on how I edit it, but the steering in this definitely isn't as good as it is in the ZHP. it's a little bit slower of a rack. It's around 15.4 to 1, whereas the ZHP is around 13.7. So it's a faster rack, and I just think that like the steering speed, the steering feel is just feels a bit better in the ZHP. There's people who do the ZHP steering swap into M3s. I haven't done it, but based on driving these two cars, I could definitely see why a lot of people would. Driving around town on the freeway, it's definitely not as comfortable, so the suspension is a bit harder. The interior is also a little bit louder. So I recorded about 84 decibels at 75 miles an hour in my ZHP and 90 decibels or so in the M3 here. So it's a bit louder and a bit more uncomfortable, in terms of the daily commutes. You could still commute these cars. They're, still solid. Many still run up to, 200,000 miles. Mostly problem-ish free, I'll say. But, as much as I say it's not as good, around town, this car really comes alive on track, especially with this SMJ transmission. You can really just keep your both hands on the wheel and really focus on your driving. And, this car pulls throughout the red line or throughout the RPMs just like the non-AM cars do. And it just pulls so beautifully, so smoothly. It sounds so good too. This S54 with the individual throttle bodies just has a sound like no other car. But you do have to rev this car out. So it doesn't really make a whole ton of torque down low. So you really have to, make sure you're always kind of high in the RPMs. Seats are well bolstered. I do prefer cloth seats. You could get cloth seats in the M3, but mine has the leather. Bolstering is a bit more aggressive though in M cars. You can definitely feel the more aggressive bolstering, and it helps to hold you in, especially for someone of of my size. I'm kind of small, so the extra bolsters are welcome for the leather seats, because I tend to slide around it a little bit more. Let's see, so hopefully I can get another clear off-ramp here. We'll have to cross our fingers a little bit. Oh gosh, this Prius. Alright, let's see. Looks like we're going to have a clear off-ramp. Let's go ahead and go for it. Southern California drivers. Well, even though I couldn't really, do a fun off-ramp, I could tell you that in the canyons, both the ZHP and the M3 are equally as fun. The M3 really feels at home though is when you're between like 7 and 10 tens kind of driving. Just around town on the freeway, you could really tell that the M3 just feels bored. But as they say, when kind of as a catchphrase, you feel most alive when you're kind of on the edge of death, and that's the way this car feels. Like when you're on the edge with this car is really when the magic starts to happen. Like when you're driving around town or even in the canyons, it's kind of hard to appreciate the differences between the M3 and the ZHP. But when you're really, hammering this car, really driving at the limit, that's when the M3 really shines and where the ZHP kind of falls apart a little. So, again, like a, ZHP is good up to about 7/10, and then it kind of plateaus, doesn't really still holds its own past that, but it doesn't really get any better. Whereas the M3 is just so much more rewarding the faster and faster you drive it. Especially with the limited slip too, it helps to get the front end pointed a little bit better, so it doesn't understeer as much as the non-M cars do. And the wider stance too, thanks to the big bulging fenders, really just gives this car a little bit more of a planted feel. And you can really appreciate the difference in grip too. So yeah, one way that SMG owners work around the kind of derpiness in the transmission around town, just let off the gas a little bit and it really helps to smooth things out. So you're not kind of doing this whole head bobbing thing every time you're driving around town. Just let off the gas, a little bit, and it really helps to smooth things out. So overall, like in terms of maintenance, this car is much more expensive to maintain. I'd say, in my, 7 years of ZHP ownership, I'd probably spending the same in roughly 7 months of M3 ownership. So definitely a big difference in cost. Also, you have to consider like insurance costs, consumable costs. Those are always going to be more expensive on an M car. But still, this M3 is such a sweetheart to drive too. It's really just comes down to what type of driving you're doing, what kind of usage you have for it, to really identify which one might be a better car for you.
Alright, so coming back from the drive, the M3 is so much more raw and visceral and so much more entertaining, and I do prefer the faster steering rack of the ZHP compared to the M3 steering rack. The SMG is also a lot of fun despite its derpiness around town, and the manual transmissions, if you do get a manual transmission in your M3, is going to be more valuable, so about 25% more so, but the SMGs are, I'd say, the second best transmission, as long as they're functioning properly, but they are expensive to maintain. But just overall, the M3 is just so incredible. But equally incredible is the ZHP. It trades some of that rawness for more livability and comfort, but it still is a great handling machine. As mentioned, it's fantastic up to about 710s and hits its peak there, while the M3 lives for that 8, 9, and 1010s kind of driving, and just gets better the harder and harder you push it. If I had to make a performance to value comparison, I would say that the ZHP is about 85% of the M3 performance at about 35% the cost. The ZHP is equally fun in the canyons, but as the M3, but more livable, and overall the M3 just lives for that track driving. So talking about pricing, with clean ZHPs now into the bottom end of M3 territory, about $10,000 to $15,000 for roughly, I'd say around 100,000 miles or so, or even more M3, there's a big thing to keep in mind, and any M3 in this price range is almost guaranteed to need some work. Rod bearings are notorious on these cars and will need to be replaced. Sometimes you will catch an ad that says they were done, but it's really important to determine when they were done, because if they were done during the recall, which happened way back when, probably around 20,000 miles or less, they will definitely need to be done again. The rear subframe is also another huge issue. Some ads will say that they looked at it and had no cracks, but I can almost guarantee that there is at least a hairline crack hidden underneath all that road grime. SMG cars in particular are very harsh to the rear subframe, so make sure you get it reinforced early before you get huge cracks and what is an expensive job turns into a very expensive job. These M3s also use mechanical lifters, so these usually need valve adjustments, I'd say every 30,000 miles, while non-M cars use hydraulic lifters, which don't need any adjustment at all. These are in addition to the common problems that non-Ms and M cars share, like the cooling systems, the thermostat, water pump, expansion tank, the hoses, van-offs, front control arm bushings, rear differential bushings. So for any M3 in the $10,000 to $15,000 price range, I would recommend you budget an extra $4,000 to $5,000 or so depending on your shop to have these services performed. Meanwhile, a ZHP in the $10,000 to $15,000 price range is likely to be enthusiast owned. You can find good deals from people who don't know what they have, but they're likely going to need a little bit of maintenance to spruce them up. But as a result, for these enthusiast owned cars, they're likely to have major preventative maintenance items done, like the cooling system refresh, so it's more of a finalized all set kind of price. Talking about pricing, a car's price is what someone wants to pay for it. So that's why, the Blue Book and the actual transaction price is so different. a blue book value might show a $330 with the performance package between $5,000 and $10,000, but realistically, the actual transaction prices are between $10,000 and $15,000. And I'd say part of this value comes thanks to the rise in M3 prices, so it's kind of taking the ZHP along with it, but also stems from the rarity of the ZHP package. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, there's only about 13,500 made altogether. But nostalgia also plays a huge part, so there are many out there who had these cars or remember these cars, and it's the car they wish they never sold. As few cars have kind of delivered on that same driving experience, and many kind of want to rebuy these cars again to get that feeling back. And I'd say this is especially true now that BMW transitions to a more electrified brand, as safety and size kind of dilutes the experience a little bit more than in older cars. So these E46s are fairly compact by today's standards, about the size of a Civic or Corolla. And also BMW becomes more polarizing with their design direction. Many kind of want to go back to what they feel is like a traditional BMW design. Even for me, I know that I'm eventually going to have to sell my daily driver ZHP for something more fuel efficient, and the M3 will kind of stay the weekend toy, but I definitely know my ZHP is going to be the car that I regret selling the most. So to kind of wrap everything up here, is the ZHP special? Absolutely. Is it as good as people say it is? 100%. Is it better than an M3? Well, that depends on your usage. And is it overpriced next to an M3? And I'd say definitely not. Remember, even though you can get an M3 for the same price, finding a well-sorted M3 for the same price is pretty unlikely. And the ZHP is in some ways a better car than M3 too. It really is a matter of picking your poison because you can't go wrong with either. Or you can do what I did and choose both. So thank you guys for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe. If you like the keychains you saw attached in my keys in the video, the link to how you can buy them I'll post down in the description below. And I'll see you guys next time.